Hi, everyone, and thanks for coming to my reading. I'm G. Scott Huggins, or just Scott Huggins, please, because some people think that sounds pretentious. Um, Very nearly award-winning author. Today, I will be reading from my debut science fiction novel, The Girl Who Wasn't There, Moon 2095. I really appreciate it. I'll let you know how to get a copy of your own at the end of the video, or at the link that I'm going to attach, let's be honest. All right, so the beginning of the novel, chapter 1, The Face in the Window. Jael gritted her teeth on a scream of frustration as she flew in a semicircle through the air. Twisting, she just managed to get her arms in front of her before she was slammed into the soft rubber mat. The impact slammed her crutches into her forearms with stinging force and drove her breath from her lungs. Her face bounced off the floor, burning with pain. "I told you not to try that double kick," Master Balogan said. Jael rolled painfully onto her back, tasting blood on her lips. She blinked tears away furiously, looking at her sensei. His ebony face was clean-shaven and set like a granite statue, lips compressed in a line. He stood over her like a disapproving god. Jael's brows drew down in a scowl. "I thought you were supposed to be teaching me," she said, hating the whine that tinged her voice. He said nothing, but raised his eyebrows. "Sensei," she added, too late, feeling the blood rush to her face. "Don't address me from the floor," he said, voice flat. Jael gripped her crutches and spun around, levering herself up on them and pushing up with both legs. Too far. She lost contact with the floor and nearly fell in the moon's weak gravity. "I am teaching you, young lady," Master Balogan said, "and that includes what you cannot do as well as what you can." Jael's eyes widened in shock, and she snarled silently. "Tcha!" Her sensei let out a puff of exasperated air. "I do not mean with these." His foot flashed forward and tapped her legs. "Every time I talk about what you can't do, you think I mean your disability. I'm talking about what you've learned, about your technique. I know your legs are strong, whether you can walk with them or not, but you have not learned enough, not practiced enough to use that strength yet." Jael's face burned. She had tried so hard to prove him wrong. She had thought that rising up on her crutches and kicking out with her legs would catch him by surprise. Instead, Master Balogan had caught her effortlessly by the ankles and swung her over his head like a sledgehammer. Neither move would have worked on Earth, but in Luna's 1/6 gravity, even master martial artists were still learning the limits of the possible. Even so, Master Balogan was still far ahead of her. He continued, "Instead of playing to your strengths, the balance and precision you have learned with your arms and tonfa, you keep trying to bulldoze over your weaknesses as though you can beat them into submission. That is not the way the art works. Now, since you seem so in love with building up strength, go do some push-ups under real weight and show me how far you can go." Her blood blazed with resentment, but she forced herself to say, "Yes, sensei." She turned and swung off to the weight racks, already feeling bile climbing up her throat. "They're crutches, not tonfa," she thought, her eyes locked on the huge vests hanging there. But Master Balogan never permitted her to call them that while she was practicing. They did look somewhat like the thick rods of wood with handles that allowed their wielder to block and swing to strike opponents. But her crutches were aluminum and carbon fiber, at least 3 times longer than tonfa, with flared cuffs that braced her forearms. She planted them viciously on the mat in front of her and smothered a forbidden word as she vaulted off the floor, flying through the air in a low, uncontrolled jump. Eventually, she landed and swung her legs through her crutches, moving more carefully. Jael hated the moon, how it made everything easier in the hardest possible way. Getting around was a lot easier than it had been on Earth, the way she had to lift her body with her arms and swing her legs in front of her. But at least there you could pound on the ground and not fly off balance. Laboriously, Jael lifted and buckled the weighted vests over her torso, then fitted the weighted sleeves around her arms. She struggled with the cuffs around her thighs, ankles, and knees. She rolled prone, 275 kilograms of lead encasing her. She now weighed about what she had on Earth, 123 pounds. On the moon, where gravity was only 1/6 as strong as Earth's, the human body would lose muscle mass if it wasn't regularly exercised. Fortunately, that health problem wasn't nearly as bad as the ones that plagued humans who lived in true microgravity on space stations or asteroid colonies. But while those places could spin large habitat rings for constant gravity all the way up to Earth's normal 1G, the moon couldn't. The moon's rather cumbersome answer was the weight vests. Jael reversed her crutches and gripped the handles. Setting the rubber tips atop the cuffs on the floor, she began push-ups that her sensei had ordered. Slowly. Mass was not weight. The lead weights that pulled at her did not remind her at all of how she had felt on Earth. 1, 2. They made her work harder to overcome their greater inertia. 4, 5. This was Master Balogan's favorite test of her endurance and precision, the precision she would never have in her legs. She snapped open her eyes and glared at him. 7, 8. I don't mean your disability, he'd said. Only he does. They all do. They always do, she thought. Her stomach twisted at the thought. It was why she couldn't fight the way she wanted to. 15, maybe, or 17. Damn. It was why their family was on the moon at all, and Mother and Dad thought she didn't know it. So her life could be a little easier, and so she could be a little more capable. Just never capable enough. She heaved up again and sank down, the weights beneath her digging into her stomach. Master Balogan looked down at her. 30 push-ups. No shame, he said evenly, but nothing commendable either. I can teach you nothing more today. Go and find peace in something else. Jael felt her blood racing with more than the physical exertion as she swung herself over to the lavatories and washed her mouth out. No shame. What did he know about shame? No one stared at him just for walking past them. No one thought of him as dead weight, more useless than the stupid vests. Having nowhere better to go and no one else to talk to, Jael turned toward the antechamber of the ballistics range. She thought about jumping there in a long arc, but while her legs were powerful enough to make the leap, she didn't want to risk Master Balogan's disapproving stare either. Only little kids jump everywhere just because they can, she thought. One more little joy of life that everyone seemed determined to take from her. The wide door of the range slid open, admitting her to an antechamber with gray-brown walls. A secutor stood behind the counter, between her and a rack containing a dozen varieties of weapons. The secutor looked roughly like a kneeling humanoid, a polymer-armed torso with 2 articulated arms and a featureless head. From the waist down, its thighs angled toward the floor, where it knelt on its treads. It could stand and walk or climb, but just now its feet were folded up and over its tread housings. Let me have a coil gun, she snapped, relieved not to have to be polite. Long barrel, semi-auto. The secutor's black ovoid head regarded her. The range is occupied, it said. I know the range is occupied, you worthless piece of rejected factory trash. She curled her lip in contempt. My brother's in there. Now give me the gun and ask him to let me in to join him. Coil guns cannot be dispensed until entry is imminent, replied the secutor with programmed equanimity, complying with request transmission. Sync range scenario with my converser, Jael commanded. She withdrew the flat, glassy screen. Varpal view, she said to it. Immediately, the converser's leaf-thin earpieces unfolded, and the screen itself became transparent. Complying. The lights went down in the antechamber, while Jael's converser showed her the virtual augmented roleplay of Paul's scenario. The wall containing the door to the range proper vanished out of existence. Suddenly her brother was facing her, staring through his own converser. He leveled his coil gun at her head. Looking right through her, he fired. Jael stifled a shriek and flinched, then blew out an exasperated sigh. Of course Paul hadn't been shooting at her. A shadowy flicker of motion slid in front of her brother. An eye drone. The tiny hex-jet flyer slid to one side, but her brother snapped off 3 more shots, and the hologram of the eye drone staggered in the air, crashing to the floor. He whirled as 2 more eye drones whizzed in from his flanks, firing steadily. In front of him, a larger spy drone emerged from a rip in the floor, its multi-jointed legs making Jael shudder. The monstrosity drew his fire, its heavier weapons forcing him to react. The eye drone flyers got their own shots off, and blood bloomed on his clothes. Jael swallowed in distaste. The wounds and war droids certainly looked real through the converser. Paul pronounced a word that Jael could not hear, but which was certainly on the mother-disapproved language list. Then he cocked his head and addressed the ceiling. The projections disappeared and the range lit up. Paul Wardhey grants access to Jael Wardhey, said the secutor. It swiveled at its waist and detached a long-barreled coil gun, examined it, and handed it to her along with a flechette magazine. Carefully, with the ease of long practice, Jael inspected her gun. Keeping her finger away from the trigger, she entered the range, a featureless dome over a wide, cylindrical chamber. Hey, sis, her brother said. His red-blonde hair was sweat-matted, and his pale eyebrows drew down. What's up with you that you need to interrupt my AI war campaign? Sorry, she growled. She wasn't sorry at all, but she knew she should be. It was rare enough for Paul to get the range entirely to himself, which was the only time he could run his AI war game. She didn't feel like apologizing, so she said, I don't know why you always want to play AI war scenarios anyway. It's creepy. That was true. It was bad enough that the AI war had ever happened. The thought of it happening again chilled her bones. Well, if we ever have to do this for real, he said, tapping his gun, it's the best way to practice. He looked at her. Sensei kicked you out again, didn't he? Shut up, she mumbled. He shrugged. Reset for standard practice, simulated targets, 50 meters. Jael let her right hand crutch fall and stood as straight as she could, presenting her side to the target, bracing herself on her left crutch. The flechette-throwing coil guns produced very little recoil, but what there was could still throw her off balance, since she had almost no ability to move her legs independently of each other. Through their conversers, the range went dark and two silhouettes materialized in front of the smooth armor gel walls. Jael briefly wished that there was some way they could both run through a danger room scenario, but the coil guns were loaded with real flechettes, and playing around with them where you could hit another person was needlessly dangerous. The scenarios were only for lone practitioners. There was no fear of ricochets or penetrating the walls of the hab. Metal was cheap on the moon, and the range was clad in a double thickness of foam titanium layered with graphene. On the other hand, Jael was glad enough to have an excuse not to play through Paul's AI war scenarios. Something more historical and less frightening, like World War II, would have been interesting, though. Of course, she couldn't do the legwork that would allow her to score decently, but simple target shooting was well within her capabilities. Range clear, said the synthetic voice of the secutor. Jael raised her gun, sighted along its open-work barrel, and sent 5 1.5 millimeter needles streaming toward her target with whisper cracks of sound as they went supersonic. She waited for the score. 10, 10, 10, the voice repeated. 9, 9. Over it, she heard Paul's score. 10, 9, 10, 10, 10. Her brother looked over at her, face carefully blank. What? She snapped. You told me to shut up, he said. Sensei never lets me try anything I want to do, she said, unable to keep the bitterness out of her tone. That's because you keep wanting to fight him. That's what he's supposed to be training us to do. No, Paul shook his head with the same maddening calm that he shared with their father. He's supposed to be training us to fight. That's what I said. But it's not what I said. I said you want to fight him. He's training you not to do that, and he has to get you to listen. Instead, you get mad. Then you shut him out. Then you lash out. Then he takes you to the mat. And then he throws you out. And you end up here with me out shooting you because you're shooting mad instead of shooting calm. And we both know that's not usually how it goes. Jael took a deep breath and crushed her anger with all her strength. Somehow, Paul calmed her down rather than making her angrier. I know I shouldn't, but why won't he ever at least let me try things my way? Her brother snorted. He is. He just showed you why your way won't work. Jael glared at him, but Paul only cocked his head. Oh, come on. Do you think Sensei couldn't completely stop you if he wanted to? You're just trying his patience. I just want him to show me how to do it my way so it will work, she said softly. Paul turned to face her. And why is that so different than him showing you things he knows will work? She dropped her eyes. She didn't know why it made such a difference, but it did. You calm now? He asked, or am I going to embarrass you again? Let's see if you can. She raised her pistol. This time she exhaled and pressed the trigger to the limit of its slack, squeezing it as her mother had trained her, not snapping it backward. 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, recorded the secutor. Paul was doing the same until the final shot. 8, the computer said. 8? Asked Jael. Well, you're using that great long barrel. You ought to be scoring higher. I want to work off some frustrations. Spar? Are you going to fight the way you're supposed to? Seriously, you're not working off your frustration on my head. I promise, Jael said, meaning it. They returned their guns and walked out to the surface of the great dome of Thunderhead's gymnasium. The sparring mats leaned against one of the outer walls near an airlock. Low-set, thick portholes gave a punctuated view of the lunar surface, currently bright with daylight. They removed their conversers. The ComNet virtual scope encyclopedias were sturdy, but too useful to risk in a stupid sparring accident. Paul took a red belt from a pocket of his outsuit and wrapped it around his waist. Jael had not bothered to remove her purple one. Paul began stretching. I sure do miss my gi, he said, referring to the loose jacket and pants that martial artists wore on Earth. I don't, Jael said. One more change of clothes to get in and out of, and then to lug around. Then, because she almost never got to, she smiled and said, Outsuits are always required. That's regulations. This is the dumbest place in all of Thunderhead for that regulation to apply, Paul said. This is supposed to be the emergency shelter for the whole colony. One gigantic blockhouse right next to the landing pads for emergency evacuation. If anything breaches this, our outsuits wouldn't do us any more good than wearing a nice thick coating of sunscreen. Jael tisked at him, regardless of the fact that she completely agreed. But they both knew that the regulation made sense most of the time and would no more have thought of disobeying it than they would have of parading around completely naked. Everyone wore an outsuit, the deceptively thin garment that covered them from ankle to wrist to neck. Jael spoke into the microphone set into her collar. Full contact routine. Her outsuit swelled outward at her forearms and lower legs, providing the necessary padding. Her shoes reacted similarly and sealed to her ankles. She flipped her hood up and felt the flowing material mold itself around her forehead and ears to protect her, then caught her crutches before the moon's gravity could topple them. In the case of a pressure blowout, the suit's hood would become a full-blown helmet, sealing to both her neck and the gloves in her pocket as fast as she could put them on. The air reservoir on her back would keep her alive for 30 minutes, or more if she could reach an actual air tank. But for now, the outsuit made sparring safe. Paul pulled a carbon fiber bow staff from the rack on the wall. Jael gripped her crutches, no, her tonfa now, and reversed them. They bowed to each other, and she watched her brother. He stood frozen, eyes running over her. What, she took a moment to wonder, was he watching for? At that moment, Paul struck from her right. Reflexively, she swiveled and brought up her tonfa, blocking his staff. The power of his blow knocked her off center, but she yielded to the force of it and slammed the long end of her left tonfa, this time truly using it as a crutch, into the mat. She whirled it around and down as she bounced back to the right, striking down for Paul's shoulder, but he was already spinning to her left, reversing the staff in his hands. She let her downward momentum carry her all the way to the ground, drawing her feet up under her to spin her upper body around and down while she scythed both of her tonfa under her brother's feet. The look on his face as he pinwheeled, feet spinning for the ceiling, was priceless. He fell, slowly but heavily, onto his shoulders while she was getting up. Point, he huffed. See what happens when you remember your training? Jael scowled. It was true that sweeps were her forte, but she hated the fact that she was the most dangerous when she had already fallen over, whether she was on the floor by her own will or not. Still, she converted the scowl into a wolfish smile and said, Again? They faced off a second time. This time, Jael didn't wait for her brother to move first, but swung her tonfa around with blinding speed. Paul spun into the block, holding his staff vertically. Her tonfa clacked against it, the force of the blow stinging her fingers painfully. Before she could recover, his foot shot forward, kicking her through the air. Blushing furiously, Jael felt that she had all the time in the world to assume the proper landing position so that she skipped on the mat, shoulders first. She tried to roll to her feet, but her balance failed her, and she flopped backwards beneath the window, still gasping for the breath her brother had knocked out of her. Sorry, sis, Paul said, landing beside her. Afraid I got a little excited about that opening. Stifling a curse, Jael reached out for her brother's hand. He yanked her to her feet with little effort into an embrace. Over his shoulder, she saw the flat gray plain of the Oceanus Procellarum stretching to the distant polar peaks. Once more, she wheezed. You sure? Paul asked. I'm fine, she said, her voice sounding shriller than she meant it to. Now get ready. She planted her feet and closed her eyes. Her brother was flat out better at the art than she was, and she had just given him a point by being impatient. She turned her head and snapped her eyes open, looking at the still lunar landscape, centering herself, drawing calmness from the mustached face staring into the gymnasium with his mouth open. She met its eyes, and it paled even further, then disappeared into the space of a blink. What is that? The words were torn from her. Paul rolled his eyes. Oh, come on, sis. You can't be that desperate for a point. Paul, there was a man staring in the port and... The words tumbled out of her mouth before she could think how crazy they sounded. I don't think he was wearing an outsuit. She took a deep breath. Well, not a standard one anyway. More like the old ones. Like really old. Apollo old, only not white but black. Paul gave her a look and then carefully turned. That's impossible, and besides, that's the landing field out there. No one should be walking around. It's incredibly dangerous. He turned back to her. Are you sure you didn't hit your head harder than you thought? Paul, she said in the most serious tone she could manage, I did not hit my head. There is someone walking around the landing field right now, and if nobody gets him out of there, he could be fried by the next incoming ship. All right, so that was chapter 1. Thanks so much for watching again. This is The Girl Who Wasn't There by G. Scott Huggins, and it's available for sale on Amazon for just $2.99. So if you'd like to buy yourself a copy, myself and my publisher would be much obliged. Thanks again, and I'll see about putting chapter 2 up at sometime in the near future. Bye.